The briefing room at Bagram Airfield fell silent when the mission parameters appeared on screen. 3 Navy SEALs missing for 72 hours in the Korangal Valley. Taliban forces closing in from 3 directions, weather deteriorating by the hour. Every available asset had been scrambled, searched, and returned empty. The valley had swallowed men before, but never an entire SEAL team. Intelligence suggested they were alive, holed up somewhere in the labyrinth of caves and compounds that made the region a graveyard for empires. But alive didn't mean retrievable. The window was closing. Fast. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Reeves stood at the podium, his jaw tight, eyes scanning the assembled pilots. Apache crews, Viper teams, even a pair of Predator operators who'd flown in from Kandahar. The best of the best. And then there was her. Captain Ellison Ghost Cade sat in the back row, her flight suit faded from too many missions, her face unreadable. She didn't lean forward like the others, didn't take notes, just watched Reeves with the kind of stillness that came from seeing too much. Reeves hesitated before speaking again. Everyone in that room knew what he was thinking. The A-10 Thunderbolt II wasn't sexy. It wasn't fast. It didn't have the sleek lines of an F-16 or the raw power of an Apache. It was a flying tank, a relic from the Cold War, designed to kill Soviet armor on the plains of Europe. But the Korangal wasn't a plane. It was vertical terrain, narrow valleys, and enemy forces dug into positions that had resisted American firepower for over a decade. The mission required precision, patience, and a pilot willing to fly low enough to taste the dust. It required someone expendable. "Ghost," Reeves said quietly, and the room shifted. A few pilots exchanged glances. One of the Apache crew leads actually laughed, a short bark of disbelief quickly stifled. Ellison didn't react. She just stood, her boots scuffing the concrete floor, and walked to the front. She was 34, lean and compact, with dark hair pulled into a tight bun and eyes the color of storm clouds. She'd flown more combat hours than anyone in the room, but she'd also been passed over for promotion twice. Not because she wasn't good, because she made people uncomfortable. She didn't socialize, didn't smile, didn't play the game. Reeves handed her the tablet with the coordinates. "You'll launch at 0400, alone." Ellison took the tablet, her fingers steady. "Understood." Someone in the back muttered, "They're sending the Warthog," and the room erupted in low chuckles. Ellison heard it. Everyone heard it. But she just turned and walked out, the briefing room door closing behind her with a soft click that somehow sounded louder than the laughter. Outside, the night sky over Bagram was black and infinite, stars scattered like broken glass. Ellison stood on the flight line, staring at her A-10. The ground crew had nicknamed it Widowmaker, which was ironic considering Ellison had never lost a bird. The aircraft sat low and mean, its twin engines mounted high on the fuselage, its titanium bathtub cockpit scarred from shrapnel. The GAU-8 Avenger rotary cannon protruded from the nose like the barrel of some ancient god's rifle. 30mm rounds, depleted uranium, enough firepower to shred a tank column. But tonight, it would be searching for 3 men in a valley that didn't give up its dead. Ellison climbed the ladder and settled into the cockpit. The seat molded to her body, familiar as her own skin. She began the pre-flight checks, her hands moving with mechanical precision. Fuel, hydraulics, weapons systems, radios, everything green, everything ready. She strapped in, adjusted her helmet, and flipped the master arm switch. The A-10 rumbled to life, its engines growling like a predator waking from sleep. The tower cleared her for takeoff, and Ellison taxied to the runway, the aircraft's silhouette dark against the distant mountains. At 0400, she pushed the throttles forward. The A-10 accelerated, sluggish at first, then committed, wheels lifting off the tarmac. Ellison climbed into the blackness, the airfield lights shrinking behind her. Ahead, the Hindu Kush mountains rose like the spine of a sleeping giant. Somewhere in those peaks, 3 SEALs were counting the minutes. And somewhere behind her in that briefing room, officers were already writing her off. The joke would be on them. Ghost didn't believe in impossible missions. She believed in mathematics, physics, and the 30mm cannon that could write poetry in metal and fire. The call sign Ghost had been given to her 6 years ago in Iraq, not because she was quiet, though she was, not because she was invisible, though she tried to be. It was because she had a habit of appearing exactly when you thought all hope was gone. Ellison had pulled a Marine squad out of Fallujah when every other aircraft had been driven off by enemy fire. She'd flown through a sandstorm to extract a downed pilot in Helmand, landing her A-10 on a highway under small arms fire. She'd killed a Taliban convoy 30 seconds before it overran a fire base, the explosion so close the shockwave cracked windows. And every time she'd done it alone. Not because she wanted to, because no one else would fly with her. It wasn't personal, it was reputation. Ellison didn't follow the script. She didn't wait for clearance when lives were on the line. She didn't abort when the mission turned ugly. And in a military that valued procedure as much as results, that made her dangerous. Dangerous to careers, dangerous to the chain of command, dangerous to the neat little narratives that kept wars manageable. So they'd sidelined her, given her the trash missions, the ones no one else wanted. The ones where success was unlikely and failure was expected. Ellison had flown them all, and she'd come back every time. Now at 20,000 feet she leveled off and checked her instruments. The Korangal Valley lay ahead, a black wound in the earth. No lights, no roads, just ridges and draws and compounds built into the mountainside like tumors. Intelligence had narrowed the SEAL's location to a 3-kilometer radius, which in that terrain meant basically nowhere. Ellison switched her radio to the tactical frequency. Static hissed in her ears. She keyed the mic. Bagram, this is Ghost. On station. Beginning search pattern. Copy Ghost. Be advised whether moving in. You've got 90 minutes before the valley socks in. 90 minutes to find 3 men in 100 square kilometers of hostile territory. Ellison didn't bother responding. She rolled the A-10 into a descending turn, dropping toward the valley floor. The aircraft shuddered as it hit the mountain thermals, air currents rising and falling like invisible hands. Ellison corrected, her touch light on the stick. The A-10 was a brute, but it responded to finesse. She descended to 5,000 feet, then 3,000, the terrain rising to meet her. The valley walls closed in, jagged rock faces that seemed to lean inward. This was low, lower than doctrine allowed, but doctrine didn't find missing SEALs. Ellison activated her targeting pod, the infrared sensor painting the landscape in shades of gray. Compounds appeared as bright squares, heat signatures blooming where fires burned or engines idled. She marked each one, logging coordinates, searching for patterns. The Taliban moved at night, confident in their knowledge of the terrain, but they also left traces, tire tracks, disturbed earth, the faint thermal bloom of recently fired weapons. Ellison flew the valley like she was reading a book, each page revealing another chapter of the enemy's story. And somewhere in that story, 3 SEALs were waiting. She'd been airborne for 30 minutes when the radio crackled. Not Bagram, a different voice. Weak, distorted, barely audible through the static. Any station, this is Dagger 2-3. We are, contact, need immediate. The transmission cut off. Ellison's pulse didn't change. She keyed her mic. Dagger 2-3, this is Ghost. Say again your position. Silence, then faint as a whisper, grid, November, Foxtrot. The rest was lost to static, but it was enough. Ellison cross-referenced the partial grid, her eyes flicking between the map display and the terrain outside. The coordinates placed the SEALs in the eastern section of the valley, near a compound that intelligence had flagged as a Taliban staging area. Of course, the SEALs had gone hunting and walked into a trap. Now they were pinned, surrounded, and running out of time. Ellison banked hard, responding with a speed that belied its bulk. She descended further, skimming the ridgeline at 2,000 feet. The compound appeared on her targeting pod, a cluster of mud brick buildings arranged around a central courtyard. Heat signatures everywhere. Too many to count. Ellison switched frequencies, trying to raise the SEALs again. Dagger 2-3, Ghost. If you can hear me, mark your position with IR strobe. She waited, scanning the compound. And then in the corner of her screen, a faint pulsing light, infrared, invisible to the naked eye but clear as daylight on her sensor. The SEALs were in a secondary structure 50 meters from the main compound, and between them and safety were at least 30 enemy fighters. Ellison did the math. 30 fighters, 3 SEALs, no backup, no time, just her, the A-10, and the cannon that had been designed to kill things much harder than men. She armed the GAU-8. The decision to send Ellison alone hadn't been strategic. It had been convenient. Reeves had needed a pilot willing to fly into a deteriorating situation with minimal support, and Ellison never said no. But there was another reason, one that no one in that briefing room would admit. If Ghost didn't come back, it wouldn't raise many questions. She had no family, no husband or children. Her parents had died in a car accident when she was 19, and she joined the Air Force a week later. The military was her family now, and the cockpit was her home. But even families had black sheep, and Ellison had long since accepted her role. She circled the compound once, studying the layout. The main building was 2 stories, reinforced walls, firing positions on the roof. The secondary structure where the SEALs were holed up was smaller, more vulnerable, with only one exit. The enemy had established a perimeter, fighters positioned in overlapping fields of fire. It was a textbook ambush, designed to kill anyone who tried to extract the SEALs. But Ellison wasn't anyone. She was the pilot who'd once flown an A-10 through a thunderstorm to destroy a bridge, the plane so battered afterward that maintenance had declared it a total loss. She'd walked away without a scratch. She keyed the radio. "Dagger 2-3, Ghost, I'm beginning my run. When you hear the gun, move fast." A voice came back, clearer now, desperate. "Ghost, we've got wounded, can't move without cover." Ellison's jaw tightened. Wounded changed everything. It meant they'd need time, and time meant exposure. She adjusted her approach, lining up on the main compound. The GAU-8 was accurate, but it wasn't surgical. 30mm rounds didn't discriminate. They shredded everything in their path: buildings, vehicles, people. Ellison had fired the gun dozens of times, and every time the result was the same: devastation. But devastation was what the SEALs needed. She rolled in, the nose of the dropping toward the target. The compound filled her windscreen, heat signatures scattering as the enemy realized they were being hunted. Ellison centered the pipper, her finger resting on the trigger. Range, altitude, airspeed, everything aligned. She squeezed. The GAU-8 roared to life, a sound like the earth splitting open. The aircraft shuddered, decelerating from the recoil. 65 rounds per second hammered into the compound, each round a fist of depleted uranium traveling at 3,000 feet per second. The main building disintegrated, walls collapsing in clouds of dust and debris. Vehicles exploded, fuel tanks igniting in rolling fireballs. Bodies flew, torn apart by the concussive force. Ellison held the trigger for 3 seconds, then released, pulling up hard. The A-10 climbed, engines screaming, as the compound below burned. She came around for another pass, her eyes on the secondary structure. The SEALs were moving now. She could see them on the infrared, 3 figures dragging a fourth toward the tree line. But the enemy was moving too, fighters emerging from cover, weapons raised. Ellison didn't give them the chance. She rolled in again, this time targeting the perimeter. The gun spoke, and the night turned into day. Muzzle flashes blinked out. Heat signatures vanished. The valley echoed with the sound of destruction, and for a moment, everything was chaos. Then silence. Ellison climbed to 3,000 feet, circling, her eyes scanning for movement. The compound was gone, reduced to rubble and smoke. The secondary structure still stood, barely, and the SEALs were in the tree line now, clear of the kill zone. She keyed the radio. "Dagger 2-3, Ghost, you're clear. Extraction inbound." The voice came back, shaking. "Ghost, Christ, thank you." Ellison didn't respond. She banked away, checking her fuel. Enough to loiter for another 20 minutes, enough to make sure the SEALs got out. The valley was quiet now, the enemy scattered or dead. She'd bought them time, that was all that mattered. Below, the first rays of dawn touched the peaks, turning the mountains gold. It was almost beautiful, almost enough to make you forget what had just happened. But Ellison never forgot. She carried every mission, every decision, every life saved and lost. It was the price of the call sign, Ghost, the one who appeared when hope was gone, the one who always came back alone. The extraction helicopters arrived 15 minutes later, Black Hawks thundering through the valley at low level. Ellison stayed high, watching as the SEALs were loaded aboard. One of the crew chiefs waved at her, a gesture she couldn't return from the cockpit. She just dipped her wing, a silent acknowledgement, and turned for home. The flight back to Bagram was uneventful, the sunrise painting the Hindu Kush in shades of orange and red. Ellison landed just after 0600, settling onto the runway with a thump that resonated through her bones. She taxied to the hardstand, shut down the engines, and sat in the cockpit for a long moment, listening to the silence. When she finally climbed out, the ground crew was waiting. They didn't say anything, just nodded, which was as close to respect as Ellison usually got. She walked to the debriefing, her flight suit stained with sweat, her body aching from the GS and the tension. Reeves was waiting in the operations center, along with a handful of officers she didn't recognize. They looked at her differently now, something in their eyes that hadn't been there before. Reeves gestured to a chair. "Good work, Ghost." Ellison sat, pulling off her helmet. "The SEALs. On their way to Landstuhl. All 4 will make it thanks to you." 4, Ellison had counted 3 on the infrared. The 4th must have been down, too injured to move. She'd saved them without even knowing the full picture. That was how it worked sometimes. You did the job and the details sorted themselves out later. Reeves slid a folder across the table. "Intelligence wants to debrief you on the compound. Turns out it was a high-value target. Regional Taliban commander. You took him out along with half his cell." Ellison opened the folder, scanned the photos. Faces she didn't recognize. Names that meant nothing to her. She closed it and pushed it back. "Just doing my job." One of the other officers, a Navy commander with too many ribbons on his chest, leaned forward. "Captain, do you understand what you've done? You've just eliminated one of the most wanted men in the region. This is a significant victory." Ellison met his eyes, her expression flat. "I was extracting SEALs. The rest is collateral." The commander blinked, taken aback. Reeves cleared his throat, a signal for the others to let it go. They didn't understand Ellison, and they never would. To her, the mission was binary, success or failure, lives saved or lives lost. Everything else was noise. The medals, the commendations, the recognition, they didn't matter. What mattered was the next mission, the next call, the next time someone needed her, because that's what Ghost did. She answered. The debriefing lasted an hour, the same questions asked in different ways, the same answers given with mechanical precision. When it was over, Ellison stood and walked out without waiting to be dismissed. She needed air, needed space. The operations center felt too small, too full of people who wanted to turn her mission into a story, a narrative they could use. But Ellison's missions weren't stories. They were scars. Each one cut a little deeper, left a mark that never quite healed. She walked to the edge of the flight line, staring at the mountains. The valley was hidden now, swallowed by distance and haze, but she could still see it in her mind. The compound, the heat signatures, the moment she'd squeezed the trigger and ended lives to save lives. It was a calculus she'd learned to live with, but it never got easier. Behind her, someone approached. She didn't turn. "Captain Cade." It was Reeves. Ellison glanced over her shoulder, then back at the mountains. "Sir." Reeves stood beside her, hands in his pockets. He was quiet for a long moment, just watching the sky. "You know they're calling you a hero back at Bragg." Ellison's laugh was dry, humorless. "They don't know me." "Maybe not, but they know what you did." Reeves paused, then added, "The SEALs want to meet you, to thank you." Ellison shook her head. "Not necessary." "They think it is." She turned to face him, her gray eyes hard. "Sir, I don't need their thanks. I need to fly, that's all." Reeves studied her, something like pity in his expression. "You ever think about what happens when you can't fly anymore, when this all catches up to you?" Ellison didn't answer, because the truth was she didn't think about it. couldn't afford to. The moment she started thinking about the future, about life outside the cockpit, was the moment she'd lose her edge. And without that edge, she was nothing. Just another pilot, just another name on a roster. Reeves sighed, recognizing the conversation was over. "Get some rest, Ghost. You've earned it." He walked away, leaving Ellison alone on the flight line. The sun was fully up now, the day already hot and dusty. Somewhere in the distance, helicopters took off, their rotors thumping a steady rhythm. Ellison watched them go, then turned and headed for her quarters. She had 12 hours before her next mission. 12 hours to sleep, eat, and prepare. 12 hours to be human. But even in sleep, she'd dream of the valley, the gun, the silence that followed the storm. Because Ghost never really left the cockpit. 3 days later, Ellison was back in the air, this time escorting a convoy through the Tangi Valley. It was supposed to be routine, a milk run to keep her flight hours current. But routine didn't exist in Afghanistan. The convoy hit an IED 20 minutes into the route, the lead vehicle flipping onto its side, soldiers scrambling for cover as small arms fire erupted from the surrounding hills. Ellison was overhead within seconds, her targeting pod scanning for shooters. She found them quickly, fighters positioned in a dried riverbed, their muzzle flashes bright against the terrain. She didn't wait for clearance. The GAU-8 roared and the riverbed exploded, dirt and rock and bodies thrown into the air. The convoy radioed their thanks, but Ellison was already scanning for the next threat, the next target. That's how she flew. Always looking ahead, always anticipating. By the time the convoy reached its destination, she'd expended half her ammunition and saved a dozen lives. And no one outside that convoy would ever know. That night back at Bagram, she found a message waiting in her quarters. Handwritten on a piece of notebook paper folded into quarters. She opened it, her eyes scanning the words. It was from one of the SEALs she'd extracted. His name was Garrett. He thanked her, told her he had a wife and 2 kids back home, said he owed her everything. Ellison read it twice, then folded it and tucked it into her flight suit pocket. She didn't know what to do with gratitude. It felt foreign, uncomfortable, like wearing someone else's clothes. But she kept the note, because even Ghost needed reminders that what she did mattered. The weeks blurred together after that. Ellison flew mission after mission, her A-10 becoming an extension of her body. She knew every rivet, every gauge, every quirk of the aircraft. She could feel when something was wrong before the instruments showed it, could anticipate the enemy's moves before they made them. The other pilots started calling her the Reaper, though never to her face. Because wherever Ghost went, death followed. But it was the enemy's death, not theirs. And slowly, grudgingly, respect began to replace mockery. It started small. A nod from an Apache pilot in the Chow Hall, a request from a Marine ground commander for her specifically on a close air support mission. The maintenance crews began treating her A-10 with extra care, understanding that the plane and the pilot were inseparable. Ellison noticed, but she didn't acknowledge it. She just kept flying, kept answering the call, kept being the one who showed up when no one else would. Because that's what Ghost did. That's all she'd ever done. 6 weeks after the Korangal mission, Ellison was summoned to Reeves' office. She arrived in her flight suit, expecting another briefing, another impossible mission. But Reeves wasn't alone. Seated across from him were 3 men in Navy fatigues, their faces weathered and serious. Ellison recognized them immediately. The SEALs from the valley. Garrett was there, along with his team leader and another operator she'd seen on the infrared. They stood when she entered, and Garrett extended his hand. "Captain Cade, finally." Ellison shook his hand, her grip firm. "You didn't have to come all this way." Garrett's smile was tired but genuine. "Yeah, we did." The team leader, a wiry man with a scar across his jaw, stepped forward. "Ma'am, we wanted to say this in person. What you did. There aren't words. You saved our lives, all of us." Ellison shifted, uncomfortable with the attention. "I was doing my job." "Your job was to find us," Garrett said quietly. "You did a hell of a lot more than that. You flew into a kill zone alone and took apart an entire enemy position. That's not a job. That's—" he trailed off, searching for the word. "That's who you are." Ellison didn't know how to respond. She looked at Reeves, who just gestured for her to sit. The SEALs sat too, and for the next hour they talked. About the mission, about the valley, about the moment they'd heard the A-10's gun and known they were going to live. They told her about the fourth man, the one she hadn't seen clearly. He'd been shot in the chest, bleeding out, minutes from death. Garrett had been trying to keep him alive, whispering promises he didn't believe. And then the compound had exploded, and hope had returned. "You gave us a miracle," the team leader said, "and we don't forget miracles." Ellison sat quietly, absorbing their words. She'd spent so long being invisible, being the joke, the expendable asset, that hearing this felt surreal. But it was real. These men were real. Their gratitude was real. And for the first time in years, Ellison felt something crack inside her, some wall she'd built to keep the world at a distance. She didn't cry, didn't smile, but she nodded, and that was enough. When the SEALs left, Garrett paused at the door. "One more thing, Captain. That call sign of yours, Ghost, we looked into it. Now we know why. You're the one who's there when everyone else is gone, when all hope is lost. You're the ghost that saves lives." He saluted, crisp and respectful. "Thank you." Ellison returned the salute and Garrett walked out. Reeves leaned back in his chair, watching her. "You okay?" Ellison stood, adjusting her flight suit. "I'm fine, sir." "You don't have to be, you know, fine." She met his eyes, and for a moment she let him see past the armor. "I know." But she was fine, because the missions kept coming and the A-10 kept flying and Ghost kept answering the call. That was her purpose. That was her legacy. And as long as there were people who needed her, she'd be there. Silent, relentless, unstoppable. The war didn't stop for gratitude. 2 weeks after the SEALs' visit, Ellison was tasked with supporting a British SAS team operating near the Pakistan border. The mission was classified, the details sparse, but the SAS had a reputation for going where others wouldn't, and they needed air cover that could keep up. Ellison launched at midnight, the sky black and moonless, the mountains invisible except for the faint glow of her instruments. She flew by feel, trusting the A-10 to carry her through the darkness, trusting herself to find the team when they needed her. The SAS called her in 3 hours later, their voices clipped and British and utterly calm despite the chaos in the background. They'd walked into an ambush, 30 fighters in a fortified position, and they needed immediate fire support. Ellison didn't ask questions. She found the grid, rolled in, and unleashed the GAU-8 with surgical precision. The enemy position evaporated, and the SAS extracted without a single casualty. One of the operators radioed afterward, his accent thick with amusement. "Ghost, you Yanks know how to make an entrance." Ellison allowed herself a small smile. "Just keeping you honest." "Keep doing what you're doing, love. The world needs more like you." She signed off, the words lingering in her mind. The world needs more like you, but there weren't more like her. There was just her, alone in the cockpit, alone in the sky, alone in the war. And that was fine, because being alone meant she didn't have to worry about anyone else, didn't have to carry the weight of their expectations or their fear. She just had to fly, and she was very, very good at that. The months turned into a year and Ellison's reputation grew. Pilots who'd once mocked her now sought her advice. Ground commanders requested her by name. Intelligence officers studied her tactics, trying to understand how she consistently succeeded where others failed. But Ellison didn't have a secret. She just had commitment to the mission, to the people on the ground, to the idea that every life mattered even if hers didn't, and that commitment made her dangerous, not to the enemy, to the bureaucracy, to the people who wanted war to be neat and controllable and safe. Ellison was none of those things. She was chaos wrapped in discipline, a weapon pointed at anyone who threatened the people she protected. And then came the mission that would define her. It started with a distress call from a forward operating base in Paktika province. The base was under siege, hundreds of Taliban fighters overwhelming the defenses, casualties mounting, ammunition running low. Every available aircraft had been scrambled, but a sandstorm had grounded most of the air assets. Apache couldn't fly. Vipers couldn't fly. Even the predators were blind, their cameras useless in the swirling dust. But the A-10 could fly. It had been designed to operate in the worst conditions, to keep fighting when everything else quit. And Ellison was the only pilot crazy enough to try. Reeves found her in the ready room, prepping her gear. "Ghost, you can't fly in this. The visibility is zero." Ellison zipped her flight suit, her expression calm. "The base has 30 minutes, maybe less. You won't make it there in time. And even if you do, you won't be able to see anything." Ellison slung her survival vest over her shoulders, checking the pouches. "Radio, flares, first aid. Then I'll fly by instruments, and when I get there I'll find them." Reeves grabbed her arm, stopping her. "This isn't about being a hero, Ellison. This is about staying alive. You die out there and no one wins." She looked at him, her gray eyes hard as stone. "If I don't go, they all die. That's not a choice, sir. That's math." She pulled free and walked to the flight line, the sandstorm howling around her. The A-10 sat in the maelstrom, barely visible, the ground crew huddled beneath the wings for shelter. Ellison climbed into the cockpit, the sand stinging her face, and strapped in. The engines roared to life, and she taxied to the runway, the wind buffeting the aircraft, trying to push her off course. She corrected, her hands steady, and pushed the throttles to full. They accelerated into the storm, and for a moment Ellison couldn't see anything. Just sand and wind and darkness. And then she was through, climbing into the clear air above the storm, the sky vast and empty. She turned toward Pactica, the A-10 steady beneath her, and keyed the radio. "Viper Base, this is Ghost. Inbound, hold on." Below, the storm raged, but above the stars were cold and bright, and Ghost was coming. Flying through the storm was like diving into an ocean of sand. The A-10 shuddered and groaned, the turbulence violent enough to rattle Ellison's teeth. She flew on instruments, trusting the altimeter, the heading indicator, the artificial horizon. Outside the canopy, the world was a brown blur, the sand so thick it blocked out the sun. But Ellison had flown through worse. She'd flown through thunderstorms, through anti-aircraft fire, through the smoke of burning oil fields. A sandstorm was just another obstacle, another test of will, and she'd never failed a test. The flight to Pactica took 35 minutes, every second an eternity. Ellison's radio crackled with updates from the base, each one more desperate than the last. They were down to their last magazine. The perimeter was collapsing. Wounded were stacking up in the aid station. The Taliban were inside the wire. Ellison didn't respond, just flew, her focus absolute. When she finally reached the coordinates, she descended into the storm, dropping through the murk like a stone. At 1,000 feet, she leveled off, her eyes scanning the targeting pod. The base appeared as a cluster of heat signatures, surrounded by a swarm of smaller blips. The enemy, hundreds of them. Ellison keyed the radio. "Viper Base, Ghost, I'm on station. Mark your positions with IR strobes." A voice came back, ragged and breathless. "Ghost, Christ, we're everywhere. The enemy's inside the wire. If you fire, you might hit us." Ellison's jaw tightened. She zoomed in on the targeting pod, studying the patterns. The friendly forces were clustered near the command building, heat signatures bright and stationary. The enemy was moving, flowing toward the center like water. There was a gap, maybe 50 meters, between the two groups. Not much, but enough. Ellison lined up on the outer edge of the enemy formation, her finger on the trigger. "Viper Base, get everyone inside. Now." "Ghost, we can't." "Now." The voice hesitated, then, "Copy, 30 seconds." Ellison counted, her breathing slow and even. 29, 28, 27. She adjusted her aim, compensating for the wind, the altitude, the movement of the targets. 10, 9, 8. The GAU-8 was ready, loaded with high-explosive incendiary rounds designed to turn men into mist. 3, 2, 1. She squeezed the trigger. The gun erupted, the sound swallowed by the storm but felt in the cockpit, a vibration that rattled her bones. The round screamed downward, punching through the sand and into the enemy formation. Explosions blossomed, bright flashes of light against the brown haze. Bodies flew. The enemy scattered, but Ellison didn't let up. She walked the fire across the compound, methodical and precise, each burst destroying another cluster of fighters. The A-10 decelerated from the recoil, and she pushed the throttles forward, maintaining speed, maintaining control. She made 3 passes, emptying her ammunition, the gun falling silent only when the last round was spent. Ellison climbed out of the storm, her hands shaking now, adrenaline finally catching up. Below, the base was quiet. No more gunfire. No more voices on the radio. She keyed the mic. Viper base, Ghost, status. Silence, then faint and distant. Ghost, we're clear. You stopped them, all of them. Ellison closed her eyes, exhaling slowly. Good, medevac inbound. Negative, storm's too thick. We're on our own until it clears. Ellison opened her eyes, staring at the fuel gauge. She had enough to make it back to Bagram, barely. But if she left now, the Taliban might regroup, might hit the base again. And the wounded wouldn't survive another assault. She made the decision in a heartbeat. Copy. I'll remain on station. Ghost, you're out of ammo. What are you going to do? Ellison looked at the A-10's wings, at the empty pylons where the missiles should have been. She had no weapons, no gun, no bombs, just the aircraft and her willingness to use it. I'll figure something out. Ghost out. She circled the base for the next 2 hours, flying low enough that the Taliban would know she was there. It was a bluff, but a convincing one. The A-10 looked dangerous even without weapons, and the enemy had no way of knowing her gun was empty. Every time she made a pass, the fighters on the ground scattered, unwilling to risk another barrage. Ellison kept flying, kept circling, her fuel gauge dropping towards 0. Finally, the storm began to clear, and a pair of Apache appeared on her radar. She handed off the mission and turned for home, the A-10 sputtering as the tanks ran dry. She glided the last 10 miles, the engines dead, the aircraft a 20-ton glider. The runway at Bagram appeared through the haze, and Ellison lined up, her approach steep and fast. She touched down hard, the landing gear screaming in protest, and rolled to a stop just short of the overrun. The ground crew ran to the aircraft, their faces pale. One of them climbed the ladder, staring at Ellison. "Ma'am, you just dead-sticked an A-10. How the hell are you alive?" Ellison unstrapped, her body aching. "Practice." She climbed out, her legs weak, and walked to the debriefing. Reeves was waiting, along with a crowd of officers and enlisted personnel. They stared at her like she was a ghost, which Ellison supposed she was. Reeves stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "Captain Cade, you just saved an entire base, against orders, flying through a sandstorm with no ammunition, and you dead-sticked the landing." He paused, then saluted. "You're either the bravest pilot I've ever met or the craziest." Ellison returned the salute, her voice quiet. "Does it matter?" Reeves smiled, a rare expression. "No, I suppose it doesn't." The crowd erupted in applause, a sound that felt alien to Ellison. She stood there, unsure how to respond, and then someone handed her a bottle of water. She drank, the liquid cold and clean, and let the moment wash over her. For the first time in her career, she wasn't alone. She was surrounded by people who understood what she'd done, who respected her not despite her recklessness but because of it. It was overwhelming. It was terrifying. And it was everything she'd never known she wanted. But the applause faded and the crowd dispersed, and Ellison was alone again. Because that's how it always ended, with her and the sky and the next mission. She walked to her quarters, collapsed onto the bunk, and slept for 12 hours straight. When she woke, there was another message waiting. This time it wasn't from a SEAL or a Marine. It was from the commander of Viper Base, a colonel named Harris. He thanked her, told her she'd saved 63 lives, said he'd recommend her for the Silver Star. Ellison read the message, then deleted it. She didn't need a medal, she just needed to fly. The Silver Star came anyway 6 weeks later, pinned to her chest in a ceremony she didn't want to attend. Reeves insisted, and Ellison stood on the platform, staring at the crowd, feeling like a fraud, because she wasn't a hero. She was just a pilot who couldn't say no, who couldn't walk away when people needed her. The medal felt heavy, the ribbon a weight she didn't want to carry, but she wore it because that's what they expected. And after the ceremony, she went back to flying, the medal tucked away in a drawer, forgotten. The war continued as wars do. Ellison flew mission after mission, her A-10 a constant presence over Afghanistan. She became a legend, though she never tried to be. The SEALs told stories about her. The Marines requested her for their most dangerous operations. The pilots at Bagram started calling her Saint Ghost, a nickname that made her uncomfortable but stuck anyway, because she was both. A saint to the people she saved, a ghost to the enemies she destroyed. And somewhere in between, she was still just Ellison, a woman who flew because she didn't know how to do anything else. But legends have a cost, and Ellison was about to pay it. The mission came down on a Tuesday, classified and urgent. A high-value target had been located in a compound near the border with Pakistan. Intelligence suggested he was planning an attack on coalition forces, something big enough to change the course of the war. A strike team was being assembled, but they needed air support. Specifically, they needed Ghost. Ellison was briefed in a secure room, the details sparse but chilling. The compound was heavily defended. The target had to be eliminated. And failure wasn't an option. Ellison accepted the mission without hesitation. She always did, but this one felt different. There was something in Reeves' voice, a hesitation, a weight. He didn't look at her when he handed over the mission file, and that told her everything she needed to know. This was a one-way trip, or close to it. Ellison read the file, memorized the coordinates, and walked to the flight line. The A-10 was waiting, loaded with every weapon she could carry. Mavericks, JDAMs, a full load of 30. It was a fortress with wings, a flying arsenal. And Ellison climbed into the cockpit, ready to unleash it all. The flight to the border took 3 hours, the terrain below shifting from mountains to desert. Ellison flew at altitude, keeping her distance from the target until the strike team was in position. They radioed when they were ready, and Ellison descended, dropping through the night sky like a hammer. The compound appeared on her targeting pod, a fortress of concrete and steel, surrounded by anti-aircraft emplacements. This wasn't going to be easy, but easy wasn't why they called Ghost. Ellison armed the Mavericks and locked onto the first AA gun. She fired, the missile streaking away, its exhaust bright against the darkness. The gun exploded, a fireball that lit up the compound. She fired again and again, each missile finding its target. The sky erupted in flames, and then the gunfire started. Tracers arced toward her, bright streams of light searching for the A-10. Ellison jinked, the aircraft responding instantly, and dove toward the compound. The GIU-8 roared, tearing through the remaining defenses, and the strike team moved in. But the enemy wasn't done. A missile launched from the compound, a surface-to-air weapon that locked onto the A-10's heat signature. Ellison saw it on her sensors, a red icon climbing fast. She deployed flares, chaff every countermeasure she had. The missile ignored them, tracking her engine heat. She banked hard, pulling GS that blurred her vision, but the missile stayed locked. It was going to hit. Ellison knew it with absolute certainty, and in that moment she made a choice. She turned the A-10 toward the compound, toward the target, and pushed the throttles to full. If she was going down, she was taking the enemy with her. The missile closed, and Ellison armed the JDAMs, releasing them in a ripple. The bombs fell, guided by GPS, and Ellison pulled up, climbing as hard as the aircraft would allow. The missile hit, slamming into the A-10's left engine. The aircraft shuddered, alarms screaming, and Ellison fought for control. Below, the JDAMs detonated, obliterating the compound in a series of massive explosions. The target was gone. The mission was complete. But the A-10 was dying. Ellison silenced the alarms, her hands moving with mechanical precision. The left engine was gone, flames pouring from the nacelle. The right engine was faltering, damaged by shrapnel. Hydraulics were failing. Flight controls were sluggish. The aircraft was falling, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. She keyed the radio, her voice calm despite the chaos. Bagram, Ghost, I'm hit. Going down near the border. Tell the strike team. Mission complete. Reeves' voice came back urgent. Ghost, eject now. Ellison looked at the altimeter. 2,000 feet. Not enough time for the chute to deploy fully. If she ejected now, she'd hit the ground too hard. Survive, maybe, but crippled and deep in enemy territory. She made the calculation in a heartbeat. Negative, I'm riding it in. Ellison, don't. She switched off the radio. The ground rushed up to meet her, the desert flat and unforgiving. Ellison aimed for a dry riverbed, the only clear space she could see, and pulled back on the stick. The A-10 leveled off, skimming the sand, and then the wheels touched. The aircraft bounced, slammed down again, and the landing gear collapsed. The fuselage hit the ground, grinding through rock and dirt, the world a blur of noise and violence. And then, suddenly, it stopped. Ellison sat in the cockpit, alive. Bruised, bleeding, but alive. The A-10 was a wreck, the fuselage cracked, the engines dead. But she was down. She'd ridden it in, just like she said. And now, in the silence of the desert, Ghost was finally, truly alone. Ellison unstrapped and forced open the canopy, the metal groaning in protest. She climbed out, her body screaming in pain, and dropped to the sand. The A-10 lay behind her, broken but still intact, a monument to what she'd survived. Smoke rose from the engines, black against the dawn sky. She checked her survival vest, taking inventory. Radio, flares, water. A sidearm with 2 magazines, not much, but enough. She activated the emergency beacon and started walking, heading west, away from the border. The desert stretched endlessly, the sun rising hot and merciless. Ellison walked for hours, her body running on adrenaline and stubbornness. She knew the area was hostile, knew the enemy would be searching for her. But she also knew that help was coming. Reeves wouldn't leave her. The strike team wouldn't leave her. Ghost had saved too many lives to be abandoned now. She just had to survive long enough for them to find her. By midday, the heat was unbearable. Ellison found a rocky outcrop and sheltered in its shadow, conserving her strength. She sipped water, rationing it carefully, and watched the horizon. Nothing moved. The desert was empty, a wasteland that seemed designed to kill. But Ellison had been in worse places. She'd survived Iraq, Helmand, the Korangal. She'd survived this too. She closed her eyes, letting her body rest, and waited. The sound of rotors woke her. Ellison's eyes snapped open, her hand going to her sidearm. She scanned the sky, and there, silhouetted against the sun, were 2 Black Hawks, American. She stood, waving, and the helicopters banked toward her. They landed 50 meters away, the rotor wash kicking up a sandstorm. Ellison shielded her eyes and walked toward them, her gait uneven but determined. The crew chief jumped out, running to her. "Captain Cade, Jesus, you're alive." Ellison nodded, too tired to speak. The crew chief helped her into the helicopter, and she collapsed onto the bench seat. The Black Hawk lifted off, banking hard, and Ellison watched the desert fall away. Below, the wreckage of the A-10 grew smaller until it was just a dark smudge against the sand. She'd left part of herself there, in that cockpit, in that crash. But she'd survived. And that's what mattered. The flight to Bagram was short, and when Ellison stepped off the helicopter, Reeves was waiting. He looked older, the stress of the last 24 hours etched into his face. He didn't say anything, just pulled her into a brief, awkward hug. Ellison stiffened, unused to the contact, but didn't pull away. When Reeves stepped back, his eyes were wet. "You scared the hell out of us, Ghost." Ellison's voice was hoarse. "Scared myself." Reeves laughed, a sound caught between relief and disbelief. "The target's confirmed dead. The strike team made it out. And you," he trailed off, shaking his head, "you crashed an A-10 in enemy territory and walked away. How?" Ellison shrugged. "I had things to do." Reeves smiled, and for a moment the weight of command lifted. "Yeah, I suppose you did." Ellison was grounded for 2 weeks while she recovered. Broken ribs, a concussion, lacerations that required stitches. The doctors told her she was lucky, that the crash should have killed her. Ellison didn't feel lucky. She felt restless, trapped in the hospital bed, watching the sky through the window. The A-10 was gone, declared a total loss, but maintenance had already started prepping a replacement. They told her it would be ready in a month. Ellison told them she'd be flying in 2 weeks. They didn't argue. The world outside the hospital kept turning. The war continued. Pilots flew missions. Soldiers fought and died. And Ellison sat in her bed, reading reports, planning her return. But something had changed. The crash had cracked something inside her, some part of the armor she'd built over the years. She thought about the people she'd saved, the lives that had continued because of her. She thought about the SEALs, the Marines, the soldiers at Viper Base. She thought about Garrett's note, still tucked in her flight suit. And for the first time, she wondered if it was enough. Not the missions. The missions were never in question, but the cost, the isolation, the years spent alone in the cockpit, disconnected from everything except the job. Ellison had told herself it was necessary, that caring about anything else would make her weak. But now, lying in that hospital bed, she wasn't so sure. Maybe weakness wasn't the problem. Maybe the problem was thinking she had to do it all alone. When she was finally discharged, Ellison walked to the flight line. The new A-10 was waiting, pristine and untouched, the ground crew still working on the final checks. She climbed into the cockpit, settling into the seat, and ran through the pre-flight. Everything was perfect, but it felt wrong. This wasn't her aircraft. This wasn't the bird that had carried her through 100 missions, that had saved her life as many times as she'd saved others. This was just a machine. And for the first time, Ellison understood the difference. She climbed out, nodding to the crew chief. "She's ready." The crew chief grinned. "Best bird on the line, Captain. Treat her right and she'll bring you home every time." Ellison nodded, but she didn't respond. Because the truth was, she didn't know if she wanted to come home anymore. Not to Bagram, not to the endless cycle of missions and debriefings. She wanted something more. Something she couldn't name, but she didn't say that. She just walked away, leaving the A-10 on the flight line, and went to find Reeves. He was in his office, buried in paperwork. Ellison knocked and he looked up, surprised. "Ghost, you're supposed to be resting." Ellison closed the door behind her, standing at ease. "I've been thinking, sir." Reeves leaned back, his expression guarded. About what comes next?" Ellison paused, choosing her words carefully. "I've been flying combat for 6 years, 187 missions, 0 losses, but I can't do this forever, and I don't know if I should." Reeves studied her, his face softening. "You've given more than anyone could ask, Ellison. If you want to step back, no one would blame you." Ellison shook her head. "I'm not stepping back, I don't know, trying to figure out what this all means, why I do it, why I keep coming back." Reeves was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood, walking to the window, staring at the flight line. "You want to know why? Because you're one of the few who understands what it costs, and you're willing to pay it. That's rare, Ellison, rarer than you know." Ellison joined him at the window, both of them watching the A-10's taxi and launch. "But what if the cost is too high?" Reeves turned to her, his eyes serious. "Then you stop, you walk away and you find something else. But you don't do it because you're afraid. You do it because you've earned the choice." Ellison nodded slowly. The choice. She'd never thought she had one, but maybe she did. Maybe she always had, she just hadn't been ready to see it. 3 days later, Ellison was back in the air. The new A-10 handled differently, the controls slightly more responsive, the engines quieter, but it flew, and that was enough. She escorted a convoy, provided overwatch for a patrol, and returned to base without incident. Routine, almost boring, but Ellison flew with the same focus, the same commitment, because even routine missions mattered. Even the quiet days saved lives. That night she sat in her quarters writing. Not a report, not a debrief, a letter, to Garrett, to the SEALs, to the Marines and soldiers she'd saved over the years. She didn't know if she'd ever send it, but she wrote anyway, the words coming slowly at first, then faster. She told them what their gratitude had meant, what their survival had meant. She told them that she'd spent years thinking she was alone, only to realize she'd never been alone at all. They'd been with her, in the cockpit, in the missions, in the moments when she'd needed a reason to keep going. When she finished, Ellison folded the letter and tucked it into her flight suit. She'd decide later whether to send it, but for now it was enough to have written it, to have acknowledged what she'd spent so long denying, that she cared, that they mattered, that she mattered. The next morning, Ellison launched on another mission. And as the A-10 climbed into the Afghan sky, she looked down at the mountains, the valleys, the endless expanse of a war-torn land, and she smiled, because Ghost was still here, still flying, still answering the call, and she would keep doing it for as long as they needed her, because that's what legends did. They showed up when no one else would, and they never ever quit. The weeks passed and Ellison settled into a rhythm. Missions in the morning, maintenance checks in the afternoon, quiet evenings in her quarters. But something had shifted. The other pilots sought her out now, asking for advice, sharing stories. The ground crews treated her with a reverence that bordered on worship, and Reeves started assigning her missions that required not just skill but leadership. Ellison didn't know how to lead. She'd always been a solo act, a lone wolf in a pack of wolves. But she tried because they asked. And slowly she began to understand that leadership wasn't about giving orders. It was about showing up, about being the example, about proving that impossible was just a word. One evening, Reeves called her into his office. He looked tired, but there was something else in his expression. Pride. "Ghost, I've got news. You're being promoted to major, effective immediately." Ellison blinked, caught off guard. "Sir, I don't understand. I've been passed over twice." Reeves smiled. "That was then, this is now. You've earned it, Ellison. Hell, you've earned more than that. But major is where we're starting." Ellison didn't know what to say. She'd spent so long being invisible, being the expendable asset, that the idea of promotion felt foreign. But she nodded, accepting. "Thank you, sir." Reeves handed her the rank insignia, gold oak leaves that gleamed in the dim light. "You've changed a lot of minds, Ghost, including mine. You're not just a pilot, you're a leader, and this war needs leaders like you." Ellison took the insignia, her fingers tracing the edges. She thought about the valley, the crash, the missions that had brought her here, and she realized that Reeves was right. She'd changed. Not because of the missions, but because of the people, the SEALs, the Marines, the soldiers who'd looked at her with gratitude and respect. They'd given her something she'd never had before, purpose that went beyond the cockpit, purpose that connected her to something larger than herself. That night Ellison pinned on the new rank, and when she looked in the mirror she didn't see Ghost. She saw Major Ellison Cade, a woman who'd survived impossible odds, who'd saved countless lives, who'd earned her place. And for the first time in years she felt whole. The war, of course, didn't care about promotions. It kept grinding forward, relentless and cruel. But Ellison kept flying, kept answering the call. And one day, 6 months after the crash, she got a message. The SEALs were coming back to Bagram. They wanted to see her, all of them. Ellison agreed, curious what they wanted. When they arrived, Garrett was at the front, his face serious. He carried something wrapped in a flag, the American colors bright against the desert backdrop. He handed it to Ellison, his voice thick. "This is for you, Major, from all of us." Ellison unwrapped the flag, and inside was a plaque, engraved with the names of every SEAL she'd saved, every mission she'd flown. At the bottom, a single line, "Ghost, the one who answered when hope was lost." Ellison stared at it, her throat tight. She'd spent her entire career thinking she was alone, that her missions didn't matter beyond the immediate moment. But here was proof. Proof that every flight, every risk, every impossible decision had mattered, had changed lives, had saved futures. She looked at Garrett, at the SEALs standing behind him, and saw not soldiers but brothers. Family. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for this, for everything." Garrett saluted and the SEALs followed. A wall of respect, of gratitude, of recognition. And Ellison saluted back, her hands steady, her heart full, because Ghost was no longer alone. She never had been. The final mission came without warning. A coalition base in Helmand was under attack, surrounded by enemy forces, cut off from support. Every available aircraft had been committed elsewhere, fighting a surge across the province. But the base was going to fall unless someone intervened. Ellison was the only pilot available, her A-10 the only aircraft that could reach them in time. Reeves briefed her quickly, his voice urgent. "Ghost, I won't lie. This is bad. They're outnumbered 10-1. If you go, you might not come back." Ellison was already walking toward the flight line. "Then I'll make it count." She launched into a sky streaked with orange and red, the sun setting over the mountains. The flight to Helmand was short, but every second felt like an eternity. Ellison checked her weapons. Full load, enough to make a difference, enough to buy time. She reached the base just as the perimeter collapsed, enemy forces pouring through the breaches. The radio was chaos, voices overlapping, desperate. Ellison didn't wait for orders. She rolled in, the GAU-8 roaring, and the tide turned. For the next hour, Ellison flew like she'd never flown before. Precision strikes, danger-close fire support. She emptied every weapon, every round, until the A-10 was nothing but a flying shell. But the base held. The enemy retreated, broken and scattered. And when Ellison climbed away, her fuel gauge on empty, she keyed the radio one last time. "Hellman, Ghost, you're clear." The response was immediate, a chorus of voices, all saying the same thing. "Thank you, Ghost, thank you." Ellison flew back to Bagram, though gliding on fumes, and landed just as the sun disappeared below the horizon. She taxied to the hardstand, shut down the engines, and sat in the cockpit, staring at the sky. The stars were coming out, bright and cold and eternal, and Ellison realized that this was it, the end of her war, not because she was done, but because she'd given everything she had, and it was enough. She climbed out, her body exhausted, and walked to where Reeves was waiting. He didn't say anything, just handed her a tablet. On the screen was a message from the base commander in Helmand. It read, "Major Cade, you saved 112 lives today. We will never forget." Ellison read it, then handed the tablet back. "Just doing my job, sir." Reeves smiled. "No, Ghost, you did more than that. You showed us what it means to be a warrior, to sacrifice, to lead, and we're all better for it." Ellison looked at him, then at the flight line, at the A-10s lined up like sentinels. And she knew that this chapter was over, but the story wasn't, because legends didn't end. They just became something new, something eternal. Months later, Ellison stood on the flight line at Bagram for the last time. She was transferring stateside, assigned to train the next generation of A-10 pilots. It wasn't what she'd expected, but it felt right. She'd spent years being Ghost, the lone warrior, the one who answered when hope was lost. Now she'd teach others to do the same, to be the ones who showed up, who didn't quit, who made impossible just another word. As she walked to the transport plane, the ground crews lined up, saluting. Pilots she'd flown with, soldiers she'd saved, all of them there to see her off. And at the front, a group of SEALs. Garrett stepped forward, his face serious. "Major, we heard you're leaving. We wanted to give you this." He handed her a small wooden box. Inside was a trident pin, the SEAL insignia, and a note. It read, "You earned this, Ghost. You're one of us now." Ellison's eyes burned, but she didn't cry. She just closed the box, nodded, and boarded the plane. As the transport lifted off, she looked out the window, watching Bagram shrink below. The war would continue without her, but she'd left her mark. Not in medals or commendations. In lives. In futures. In the people who'd go home because she'd been there when it mattered most. And as the plane climbed into the sky, Ellison closed her eyes and smiled. Because Ghost was finally going home. But the legacy she'd built would live on, in every pilot who flew, in every mission flown with courage, in every heart that refused to quit. The legend of Ghost wasn't over. It was just beginning. Years later, a young pilot stood in front of a class at the Air Force Academy. She spoke about courage, about sacrifice, about the A-10 and the warriors who flew it. And when a cadet asked who inspired her, she didn't hesitate. "Major Ellison Cade, call sign Ghost. She taught me that being a pilot isn't about the aircraft. It's about the people you save, the lives you change, and the legacy you leave behind." The cadet nodded, taking notes. And somewhere in a quiet house far from the war, Ellison sat on her porch watching the sky. She didn't fly anymore, didn't need to, but she still looked up every time she heard the roar of engines, the distant sound of an A-10 on a mission. And she smiled, knowing that Ghost was still out there, still answering the call, still showing up when hope was lost. Because legends never die. They just pass the torch. And the sky, vast and infinite, would always remember the woman who'd flown through storms, through fire, through impossible odds, and never once turned back. Ghost. The one who'd saved them all. The one who'd shown them what it meant to be a hero. Not because she wanted to, but because someone had to. And she'd been ready.